talk about why art is incredibly important and that intellectual property is still stupid. I don't think anybody can deny, after 2020 and the massive wave of lockdowns and the uptick in like depression and anxiety and self-harm and everything, I don't think that anybody can deny that art is important, because those of us who survived it, those of us who went through it, we tried to stay sane through the creative endeavors of others. Now, you know how I get with definitions, and obviously, yes, art is a learned skill. It doesn't just mean the creative things, but cut me some slack here. We're just using the vernacular for right now, so I don't have to keep saying the creative arts over and over and over again. So when people were stuck alone at home, either not working or working remotely with more time, because they're not commuting, and maybe their job is just not requiring them to do busy work and be as fruitlessly busy, over the course of 8 to 12 hours as normal, whatever. People turned to TV and movies and books and comic books and all of these things in ways that they hadn't in a long time. And it's because at the end of the day, like, people want to experience things in life. You see, we have language and math and science, and that's all great. But the real thing here is that we come into this world without those tools. We come into this world pretty much equipped with this analog meat machine designed only for sensory experience. Right? We see what the light allows us to see, we touch what friction allows us to touch, etc. And it is only then, after we experience something, that we start to turn it into words and numbers and formulas and theories. And that's all fine. But the fact is that art reaches into a deeper part of us. Art reaches into a part of us that is much more visceral. And it is so incredibly important. Before the formal practice of history that we have now, the role of the storyteller in ancient society, tribal society, the role of the storyteller, it was just massive. Not necessarily a formal role of storyteller, but the grandmas and grandpas, the elders of the tribe often would be the ones telling stories, which would be giving cautionary tales and passing down the mythology and things like that. What does all of that do? That creates things to aspire to, cautionary tales, passes on the traditions. It does all this in lieu of literacy. It does all of this, in lieu of scientific formulas. What it starts doing is this aggregation of experience and just the kind of natural trying to parse out what's going on in spite of a lack of information. The storytelling process is so important, and whether that's done visually through drawing, painting, whatever, or that's done verbally, through the actual construction of story and myth, and of course written at post-literacy, whether that's done through music and to a large degree even dance. I am not a fan of dance. I don't like dancing, but you can't deny the fact that it is an incredibly important part of human culture. All of those things kind of go into what makes us us, right? Like I said, the words, the numbers, the formulas and theories, that all is back-ended on to give us a way to communicate in finer detail all of these things, as opposed to only being able to do so in story, song, and dance. So the importance of art just doesn't go away, even with all of the technology we have and all of that. People still turn to stories, people still turn to pictures, people still turn to that visceral experience of what is life at the fundamental level, because that's honestly the stuff that's important. That's the stuff that keeps us sane, and that's the stuff that keeps us striving towards something more. I just don't think that the importance of art can be overstated. Now, where I want to go from this then is something that my wife and I go back and forth on all the time, and that is, as you know, as a just the anti-government kind of person that I am, I don't think that intellectual property as a legal thing has any merit. And my wife, of course, being a writer, believes that intellectual property is, as legal rights is necessary. So here's the thing on that. When you look at the concept of intellectual property versus the actual application of it, what you end up seeing is, of course, the massive abuses of government and corporation, which, of course, corporations cannot exist without the existence of government. To think that government and corporations are two different things is just foolish thinking. Corporations are in bed with government by necessity, just by virtue of existence. And so when we look at the idea of what is intellectual property trying to do, it is trying to protect the creator of something or somebody who bought the rights from the creator, right? It is trying to protect the creator or owner of something from theft and competition. In fact, that is what it's designed for. It is designed to protect against competition. And that, right out, is kind of dumb, because if you need legal protection against competition, that means you're not competitive. So that's a bad argument. Now, protection from theft. Okay, if we're talking something that is actually physical, then yes, we start getting into a very fuzzy, nebulous zone when it comes to non-physical, streaming, downloads, things like that. Is it theft? Is it not theft? There are different arguments there. I'm not going to say that it's not theft, but also the people that are stealing downloads and streaming were probably never going to be your customer in the first place. So in a sense, it's actually more like free advertising, but that's a different argument. And that's not an excuse to say, hey, people should be able to just, enjoy your creation for free. That's not at all what I'm saying. Now, the other thing that people will say is, well, it protects against plagiarism. There's a couple of problems with that argument. I'm using plagiarism too broadly here. I just don't want to list off a bunch of words. The idea, though, is that, and this kind of goes into that protection from competition thing. The idea goes that, whoever's the first to file copyright, patent, trademark, whatever, has exclusive rights to that thing. The problem is then that shuts people out of the market who may have independently stumbled onto that same or legally close enough kind of thing on their own. And that is in and of itself causing harm, because it is literally shutting somebody else's hard work out of the market, despite the fact that they had nothing to do with you. Now, it is hard to prove that somebody did or didn't have access to your work in many cases, and I get that. Look, and there is no excuse for plagiarism, for stealing trademarked images and logos and things like that. There's no excuse for any of that. But here's the other problem with it. The laws exist, and it still doesn't stop people. In fact, the only people who benefit from copyright law are the large corporations. It is not the individuals. In fact, we have seen recently with, I am not going to remember the name of the companies, but there is a small guitar electronics or vocal electronics company in California with a name, and then there's another larger company, much larger company, that came in actually later, and used a similar name for one of their products, and now they're suing the first company because they're smaller and they feel like, well, they didn't defend their trademark, so we should be able to take their trademark and shut them out of the market. That's one of the major problems that we have, is because all this stuff has a lifespan on it. And you literally get somebody coming in this case, on the back end, coming in after somebody else created it. And this is just a name. This isn't even like a circuit or anything. You get somebody coming in on the back end and saying, well, you're just not doing anything with your own property, so we want to have the rights to that name so that we can be exclusive and you can just get nothing. Well, that is really, really terrible as well. Whereas on the other side of it, let's say, look at Electro-Harmonix and JHS pedals. They both came out with a pedal like literally within a day of each other, I think, called the Crayon. Two wildly different pedals, just a coincidence of the name. And even though Electro-Harmonix is bigger, and I think they beat Josh to the patent office by a day, they basically came to agreement and said, look, we want the name, but we're not going to go after you for your pedal. You can release your pedal. That's way cooler, right? Because they actually recognized that the two didn't have anything to do with each other, and they weren't going to be true competitors in the market or anything. Now, if it was a competitively similar pedal, that might have been a different story, right? And again, corporate shenanigans start going in on that, and that is a massive problem. So we need to come back to this idea of like copyright and intellectual property, legal intellectual property rights, all come down to, can the big corporations protect their assets, and can they take your assets from you? And pretty much always yes. So the fact is that by filing intellectual property, it doesn't really protect you from much of anything. Now on the other side of it, you might go like, well, why does Michael Malice have a copyright on his book then? He's like the king of the anarchists, right? Well, there's the other side of it. You don't want anybody shutting you out of the market. So sometimes you end up having to play by the existing rules, even if you have a massive disagreement with them, because the fact is they have more guns than you. They have a bigger bank account. They have a better team of lawyers, whatever. So the best thing that you can do is protect yourself against them in what little way you can, and go ahead and file that copyright, file that trademark, file that patent. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to act in a way that shuts other people out of the market. So we live in a society where maybe you actually have to play the game just to protect yourself, but you don't have to act in a way that is inconsistent with your principles and start shutting people out of the market for creating something that happens to have been similar. Anything that's obvious plagiarization, should be struck down. But that's not being currently stopped by the existing laws. So what good is it if it can't prevent that? But the problem is, as we mentioned before, these abuses of power and the very things that they warn against are not actually being prevented by the laws that are in place. So what ends up happening is that the intellectual property laws are being levied against you, are not working in your favor, are costing you money to protect yourself in what little way they can. And here's the real kicker of it. Even if you do file and successfully get a copyright and you want to take somebody to court for violating your copyright, your trademark, your patent, you are going to have to spend actually probably more in legal fees than you would just dealing with their theft, their improper usage, whatever. There are better ways to deal with it than legally. There are less expensive ways to deal with it than legally. Now, one of my wife's big complaints is that when you look at self-publishing services, you're not really self-publishing. You're publishing through a publishing house that basically just is going to serve as a printer and a bookstore for you. It's up to you to do the marketing and all that. So because they have some hand in the printing and the sales and whatnot, these businesses are not there really to serve the authors. They are there to serve themselves as a printing house, basically. And because of that, what they end up doing is things like, converting books to, AI audiobooks. Except that the way that publishing rights work in the publishing world, audiobook rights are separate from printing rights, are separate from movie and TV rights, right? They legally split the rights across different things, but because of AI and because of things like streaming versus broadcast television and stuff, lines are starting to get blurred and people are not being protected against that stuff. The problem is that going after the damages for those frankly shitty actions is going to be more costly than actually what you're losing by them doing that thing. So the fact is that even where you can make good cases for intellectual property actually protecting a creator or rightful owner of something, it is still more expensive to pursue the damages of infringement in most cases. And these laws really only serve these bigger corporate entities that will actually make hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars off of the release of something, have the lawyers to take care of it, and can go after somebody for maybe a few $1,000s worth of damages or whatever, and it kind of working out in their favor. But even then, a lot of times that stuff goes unchecked, and copyright intellectual property law does not go completely globally. There are some countries where that stuff happens and there's just no recourse for it because those intellectual property rights simply are not recognized by another country. And in fact, that's one of the problems that we see in a lot of manufacturing and stuff right now, that certain countries that do manufacturing will flat out steal the designs, circuit board designs and patented structural designs and whatnot, come out with their own thing, usually of inferior quality, usually with much lower quality control on it, sell it for pennies on the dollar, but making this huge profit, and people will buy it because one, these faker companies have no scruples, and two, they often run enough good marketing that people who don't do their homework are willing to just be like, oh, that's a deal, I'm going to buy that thing. Yeah, that's a problem. That's absolutely a problem. The problem is the laws don't make that go away. And look, I don't want to just quote Michael Malice here, but the problem is that all of the arguments against what we're talking about here and other getting away from government type arguments, all of the arguments against that are that it will just turn into another form of government. So if the argument against our idea of change is that you're just going to get more of the status quo, then that's not really a good argument. It's just not. So I guess what I'm really getting at is that we all, whether we know it or not, we all need art. We need the creative arts. We all want the creative arts. So be willing to pay creators. Be willing to support those that create the work. Don't be afraid to speak up when somebody you've given money to doesn't deliver on what they said they were going to create, because that's part of it too. Don't be afraid to be a critic. don't be afraid to actually take a chance and pay somebody for the work, because the fact is that if you're not willing to create it yourself, you're going to have to pay somebody else to create it. Otherwise, you're just going to sit around and complain, well, why is nobody creating things for me? Well, because you're impossible, that's why. And so what we really need to come down to is the fact that the intellectual property or not, art is incredibly important, and we need to keep creating. We need to push people to create. We need to stop denigrating people for wanting to become artists. It is a really, really important part of humanity. So I think I've probably rambled on long enough, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey.